Mr. Speaker, yes, thank you. Mr. Speaker, this morning we, of course, listened intently to the Chief Minister, as we would. I mean, it had been trailed already as a tough budget by drip feeding into the public domain. And we listened intently. And of course, towards the end, Mr. Speaker, the temerity of calling this the people's budget. The people will be tired of the antics and wish the Chief Minister would practice what he preaches. This was, Mr. Speaker, the ultimate act, especially towards the end. We are on your side. Well, he stared right into the people's eyes and slipped his hand into their pocket. It's all too much, Mr. Speaker. Some or all of these new revenue-raising measures wouldn't need to happen if the government had been disciplined last year, if they had been disciplined from the beginning. This is a case, simply put, of passing the bill on to people for their failures, of Mr. Picardo asking the people to bail him out of his mistakes and then, with drama, trying to convince them that it's not his fault. Mr. Speaker, when anyone looks at this budget, and importantly, last year's public spending, there are some big themes that emerge. On trust, Mr. Speaker, because the Chief Minister can't be trusted on the economy, public finances or the recovery. There's no real plan other than a very late and insufficient one. No direction, no willingness to address issues, and no clue. A reality check, because scratch the surface of this budget, his budget, and today's picture is far worse than presented. When you look forward to next year, it might even be worse than that. And that is down to the possibly unrealistic projections the government is making in certain key areas. And failure, Mr. Speaker, because all this is down to government failures. A failure to control expenditure, a failure to control waste, a failure of discipline, which goes all the way to the top, because there's a clear line of responsibility, and the buck stops with Mr. Picardo, who has political responsibility for the bottom line, no ifs, no buts. I'm going to deal with all those points, Mr. Speaker, in some detail, but first some observations on the macroeconomic picture, as well as some state of the nation issues that affect public finances and the economy. Mr. Speaker, we're still without a post-Brexit deal 6 years after the referendum. We've been warning about lost opportunities for some time. Not only have there been lost opportunities, there now appears to be missed boats. When with great fanfare the flimsy 8-page non-binding New Year's Eve agreement was presented as some form of Neville Chamberlain-type triumph, we warned about its vagueness, the potential concessions it may lead us to, and the fact that we had missed the boat by not landing a deal at the same time that the UK had bagged for itself a 1,000-page binding legal treaty. We were told we were wrong, and that the negotiations for a new treaty would be over in 6 months. But here we are, 18 months on, without a deal, without even the draft of one, and with problems surfacing and affecting some of our citizens. And that's, of course, inevitably compounded by the Northern Irish reality, despite any assertions that the negotiating streams are separate. Of course, they are theoretically separate, and I hope they remain so in practice, but it does not take much to understand that these are also human processes, and the potential of our process being stymied by the mounting sense of European frustration with the UK over Northern Ireland is a distinct possibility. I make clear, Mr. Speaker, that we want a safe and beneficial deal, but this uncertainty is not good for Gibraltar, and some of our people are now facing the impact of delay, as blue card holders endure an erratic and sometimes hindered passage across the border. Those are also realities on the ground. The Chief Minister may urge us not to mention this a lot or too loudly. lest we all suffer the same fate. But that is a drab, self-serving invitation tendered by a contributor, if not the architect, of the misfortune. Because we've been saying since 2018, Mr. Speaker, when Spain bagged lasting freedom of movement rights for its frontier workers, that Gibraltar lost an opportunity to bag enduring rights for our people. Again, a reality. Not because workers should not have these rights, Mr. Speaker, but because we should have got these at the same time in exchange and when we gave other things away. Mr. Picardo often says it wasn't the right time to talk about these things. I get it. He got it wrong, and he doesn't like to admit it. But that's the reality. Instead of landing permanent rights for our citizens, we gave away MOUs that were inroads into our economic and social affairs, gave frontier workers permanent rights for not much in return, and accepted a permanent tax treaty that classed some Gibraltarians and some of our companies as Spanish tax resident even when they lived here and did not do business in Spain. It discouraged inward investment by hitting at the core quality of life factors that attract investors to Gibraltar. That was the balance sheet, Mr. Speaker, before the New Year's Eve agreement, and when the boat to a new relationship with the EU was badly missed again. Now here we are, 6 years after the Brexit referendum, without a permanent deal and without knowing what the future has in store. We're now alone in this quest, as the UK has its deal. And we've got the certainty that if we do not get a deal, Spain will still have obtained permanent rights for its citizens and permanent tax concessions to its state. Facts, Mr. Speaker, not spin. And so far, a black mark as to the government's negotiating skills. He said this morning he can't go quicker. He couldn't go quicker because he was protecting our rights and our sovereignty. But he gave away rights in the MOUs and fiscal sovereignty in the tax treaty. So if this is him taking his time to protect us, then I say, no thanks. Is he suggesting by placing us in a position where we are the only ones without a deal, that this is somehow beneficial to us? Because that would be the last straw in the salesman's pitch. I suppose we are to thank him for not having landed a deal and for keeping us in this state of uncertainty. I, for one, and I'm sure I'm not alone, cannot see the logic of those statements. None of that, of course, Mr. Speaker, is to indicate we do not want an agreement. I repeat, we want a safe and beneficial agreement, and the sooner the better, clearly. Of course, whether it is safe and beneficial will need to be judged when the specific text of the draft treaty is published. Again, we think that publication should be before any treaty is entered into and not just before its ratification. It should be before the treaty parties, the UK and the EU, enter into it. After all, this is a treaty of some importance and it will affect our lives and our people. Why shouldn't it be published in draft so we can look at it before it is entered into, so that a debate can be had, so that there can be proper scrutiny, so that the people most affected can express a view, and perhaps for that view, not just to be expressed informally in the media, but in a referendum where our people decide whether to freely choose to accept the permanent relationship with the EU, which is then on offer. I'm clear that I want a deal, Mr. Speaker, that achieves freedom of movement, mobility for our people, and safeguards our economic future. We need to be politically and economically sustainable, and a good deal would enhance those prospects if it can be achieved. Uncertainty damages our economy and the prospect of inward investment. It's less likely that people making investment choices will opt for a territory whose economic relationship with the EU is unclear, over one that does not have these big challenges and uncertainties on the horizon. Again, a fact. So despite my criticisms of the negotiations so far, which I make in all honesty and clarity, and have always made, I reiterate our desire for a deal that works and is good for Gibraltar. Whatever happens, Mr. Speaker, we are at a crossroads because the present situation cannot continue much longer. At least we would not expect it to. Either there is a deal that emerges and that is acceptable, or there is not. We can't turn the clock back. And we're not in the EU. Unless a future UK government were to take the presently unforeseeable course of applying to join the EU, the best we can do is negotiate an acceptable arrangement for ourselves with Europe, because we are European, and that is where our future lies as an inevitable geographic reality that nowhere else in the UK has. So we do hope for a safe and beneficial agreement, and one that emerges soon this year, because the present Brexit uncertainty affects our economy and is present against the backdrop of global and local economic pressure. Some of that, Mr. Speaker, has been caused by the COVID pandemic, but other factors have not, and it's important to distinguish between these. The COVID pandemic left economic chaos in its wake, which will take time to recover from, but it also needs to be seen in context. So not every country was the same, and not every country will face the same issues. Some had longer lockdowns than others. Some are still suffering from these. Some were more affected by the economic pressure. In some countries, the toll of human suffering was much larger than Gibraltar. So it's important to understand the effect of COVID and not let it mask other more historic issues we had when entering the pandemic. Because clearly, by the time we entered the pandemic, we were already straddled in a historic ratcheting of direct and indirect gross debt of around 1.3 billion. This, despite the government having promised to halve the level of gross debt that existed in 2011, then 480 million. Instead, Mr. Speaker, it tripled it. That is a fact and a stunning breach of promise, and one that affects our recovery and our ability to maneuver. Again, this may be an unwelcome reminder for Mr. Picardo, but it is true and a fact. As I said last year, while the 500 million guarantee of the UK was welcome because it lowered the cost of borrowing, it did not provide absolution of past mistakes, and nor did COVID paper over the financial state in which we arrived when the COVID crisis happened. If there is further borrowing, it should be to kickstart the economy and not to plug the running costs of an unrestrained and undisciplined government. I know he doesn't like my reminders of his debt promises of 2011, but in 2012, Mr. Speaker, in his first budget speech as Chief Minister, Mr. Picardo said, to quote, "In opposition, we raised issues about the creeping growth of our nation's gross debt and why we have a clear commitment to deal with gross debt and net debt levels, as we set out in our manifesto. That is why, Mr. Speaker, our manifesto specifically provided, in clear and unambiguous terms, our approach to the reduction of national debt. Our manifesto provides, on page 27, that in respect of gross debt, our commitment is that Gibraltar's public debt will be brought down by half of its current level, whatever the current level is after the election, so that by the time of the next election in 2015, there will have been a 50% reduction. Gibraltar's gross debt is presently stated to be 480 million. End quote. In 2015, Mr. Speaker, he was still carrying on the pretense of lowering gross debt in his budget speech. But as the addiction to debt and hunger for clinging on to power grew, the government parked hundreds of millions of pounds in off-book transactions to pretend the gross debt is smaller than it is. There is now almost £1 billion in off-book indirect gross debt, and the total gross indirect and direct public debt is over 1.7 billion. That historic debt hangs over our ability to do things. It deprives us of leeway in this severe financial crisis and lessens the opportunities for us to navigate through these challenges quickly. All that is a fact. And it is a fact borne out of the financial ill discipline over the last decade when he has been in charge. Where we are now is because of him and his policies. He's had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to tackle issues, but dismissed those opportunities and instead taken the easier road of borrow and spend with everyone's money, your money. Anyone can do that. It takes guts to be disciplined, bold to ensure you say no. Instead, every time a lender has knocked on his door, all he has been able to say is yes, without regard to the precarious position it would put Gibraltar. And that is why we already were weak when we entered the COVID period. The most direct and extreme effects of COVID subsided before the beginning of the last financial year and obviously have improved further since then. The last lockdown did not occur during the last financial year. It happened almost 17 months ago. The vaccination program, which was successfully rolled out to the credit of the health authority and its staff, started 18 months ago. It's clear from the COVID fund numbers that some income streams have recovered well. I mean, in particular, income tax and to a large extent, company tax. The import duty issues may suggest factors that are systemic or structural and not about COVID, and they bear further examination in the future. During the period, up to the 31st of March 2021, the COVID fund contribution was 227 million. The last financial year, it was 135, and the forecast for next year is 40 million. But as you will see, Mr. Speaker, when I analyze the COVID fund spend for this year, we have some doubt about how or why this fund was used this year to channel some payments, and questions as to whether it will or should be used in the future. Ultimately, this fund was about costs directly attributable to COVID and not other costs. There are also surrounding economic circumstances affecting citizens. There's talk of a US recession, which of course would trickle down the whole globe, and high inflation during 2023. In the UK, inflation rates are already high at 9%, and here the index of retail prices has reached levels not seen in years, with a 7.6% increase this last year, financial year, compared to 1.4% for the year up to April 2021 and 0.6% in the year up to April 2020. This is a reality, Mr. Speaker, faced by people whenever they go to buy food in the supermarkets. Life has become more expensive when there's less money for wage rises. Everyone is tightening their belt and understands this on the ground. And so it's important for the government to lead by example. The facts, however, show that the government is not. In fact, far from leading, it is making the situation far worse, and their mistakes have contributed to the necessity for the more financially painful measures today. This is the backdrop, Mr. Speaker, which takes us to the more detailed analysis of why Mr. Picardo cannot be trusted on the economy and on public finances, because there are 7 economic sins, because there's no discipline, because there's no plan, there's bad management, and he just hopes one will magically emerge, because the worse off, the vulnerable and the most affected in this community have been left behind, despite some of the measures today. Because he's not making the public sector more efficient. He's got a duty to do so, and to make it more responsive to people, and he's failing. Because there's a duty to reduce waste and better monitor the spend and use of the people's money. Because there's been an unwillingness to make hard choices, and because the policies are often incoherent and contradictory. So, Mr. Speaker, let's look at those features that come through in detail. Last year, the government predicted a deficit of 50 million, of £1 million per week. In other words, they predicted that the public sector would cost 1 million per week more than it would generate in revenue. Let me make that clear. That is like losing over £142,000 per day, £6,000 an hour. And of course, that calculation was based on the fact that they were going to borrow £50 million to prop up public finances. It was, by all accounts, the worst public finances crisis ever. So Joe Bolzano candidly described it that way, the worst that he had seen in all his 50 years in Parliament. But let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, what happened next and over the last financial year has been absolutely staggering. Instead of being extra prudent and careful in the worst time ever for our public finances, instead of being the watchdog of the people's money, instead of being the financial shepherd that he pretended to be this morning in this crisis, the Chief Minister allowed further overspends, and not just by a few pounds here and there. Instead of making sure he kept to his own budget in the worst crisis of our history, the Chief Minister has presided over some massive overspends and could not even keep to the limits he promised this House and the people last year. Mr. Speaker, in the estimate for 2021-22, the government promised it would spend, and it was authorized to spend, 768 million. In fact, the actual expenditure this last year was 859 million. In other words, this was a figure of around 91 million above the estimated budget. They spent an additional 91 million, which they had not expected to spend, which they had promised not to spend in the worst year ever. Not just 90,000, 90 million. We appreciate some of that is represented by additional contributions to loss of revenue, but a big chunk of that is departmental overspend. In fact, the basic departmental overspend in net terms alone, compared to what it should have been, is around 35 million of that figure. Not 35,000, 35 million. To compound things, they had to resort to borrowing more. They borrowed an extra 50 million, bringing the borrowing for the last year alone to 100 million. And a large part of that borrowing was just used to pay for running costs. To put it in the simplest terms, Mr. Speaker, if you were a person who had started the year with zero in the bank account and you had then added all your income and taken out all your expenditure, you would have been down 12%. In reality, 103 million, given the figures that were presented last year and this year. Any person running a home or a business will understand that. You're earning less than you spend. If that is the case, you need to tighten your belt. You can't buy luxuries. You have to live within your means. You can't go on holiday and buy expensive things. You've got to wait till you have more money, till your income rises, and cut out unnecessary spending. You don't buy cake if all you can afford is bread. You don't go on that Caribbean cruise. Everyone understands that. But instead of tightening its belt, the government is still spending more than it receives. And worse still, Mr. Speaker, more than it promised to spend in the worst financial year ever. This is a recipe for disaster. The public finances are out of control. So in the year of the biggest deficit, Mr. Picardo failed to have the discipline of sticking to his own budget and had to borrow more. That is sheer irresponsibility with the people's money. How can he have got it so wrong? 103 million down for the year. And the government that he is responsible for not sticking to their own departmental budgets by 35 million. Mr. Speaker, there's sometimes departmental overspend, but the difference is that this was the year of the biggest deficit ever, which required the biggest discipline ever for us to get out. It's very different to overspend in a year of surplus than in a year of the biggest financial crisis ever. And when you drill down further, Mr. Speaker, there are serious warnings for the future. The Health Authority budget, for example, for last year was supposed to be 140 million, of which 134 was supposed to be regular expenditure, and 5.5 million was supposed to then come via the COVID fund as a COVID-related expenditure. In fact, the GHA spent a whopping 170 million last year, with 20 million instead of 5.5 coming through the COVID fund. And it's not necessarily, Mr. Speaker, because people are getting an amazing, unsurpassed health service. There are many excellent health professionals, but they are frustrated and morale is low. For the user, the children's dental service is appalling. The telephone appointment system at the primary care center has been a shambles. The administration services are slow and grinding, and in mental health, the complaints of lack of support and continuity of care are legion. So if we are not getting a Rolls-Royce service for the money, should we not at least expect the government to keep to the budget that they have been voted, and to ask for more money only if they're intending to provide better services? So GHA overspent by 30 million, or over 20%, not just a few thousand. And as I mentioned, when you look at that in detail, you see that instead of a projected injection of 5.5 million from the COVID fund, the GHA received 20 million last year from that source. But how were some of these COVID fund expenses? So if we take a step back, in the year of the 2 lockdowns, with the massive disruption which that entailed, with the massive extra recruitment that had to be engaged, with the massive purchase of PPE and other equipment that had to be made, with the massive commitment to the Nightingale facility that had to be planned and delivered. In those 2 years, that ended in March 2021 and spanned all the COVID expense from the beginning of 2020, in practice, a period of 15 months of intense spending from March 2020, the GHA needed 19 million from the COVID fund, 19 million of extra money to pay for the costs of COVID. So how can it be that last year, after the lockdowns, when we didn't have a lockdown last year, after the vaccination program, and after the worst effects of COVID, the GHA needed more money, 20 million, than in the worst COVID time? And if it did, why was it not foreseeable last year when the budget was presented? Why did they not know? How did they project 5.5 million would be needed and then ended up needing 20 million? Why were these payments necessary? And why was this a surprise and unforeseen? Above all, how was this COVID related, given that the sum received last year was higher than when the COVID pandemic was in full force? And even if all this was COVID, Mr. Speaker, and unforeseen, how were other aspects of the GHA overspend generated? And why was there such obvious inability to maintain the budget? I'll give you a few examples, Mr. Speaker. They had forecast they would spend 2.5 million in relief cover last year. They ended up spending 11 million. It's not even close, of which 4.3 million was a sum attributed via the COVID fund. So why was there a need for the other overspend of nearly 5 million? How can you go from 2.5 million to 11 million? How can you get it so wrong? Medical departments were supposed to spend 3.5 million last year, and they spent 18.5. It's not even close. Of that sum, of 18 million, a sum of 13.1 was funded from the COVID fund. So 18.5 instead of 3. How can you get it so wrong? They presented that budget. These are figures from their budget of last year. They must have had that information. Officials provide information and then they present the budget. Massively off. Recruitment expenses cost 2 million instead of the promised 900,000. More than 100% more. Security services cost 270,000 more than budget. Computer and office equipment were 700,000 above budget. There are other examples, Mr. Speaker. And if they got it wrong this year by such a margin, what comfort do we have that the figures this year are realistic or will be kept to? So this year, for example, you do the same exercise, they're projecting to spend 1 million in relief cover. That's down 10 million on last year. 750,000 on recruitment expenses, down from 2 million last year. 9 million in GPMS prescriptions, down from 12 million last year. 5.7 million on medical departments, down from 18 million last year. 10 million on sponsored patients, down from 14.75 last year. And 1.5 million on disposal of clinical waste, down from 2.4 million last year. In overall terms, Mr. Speaker, the GHA forecasts it will spend 128 million this year. That's 42 million pounds less than last year, and 12 million less than last year's estimate, which they didn't keep to anyway. So, are these figures realistic? Will they keep to the budget this time? And will they do so in a way that the public service is not impaired? That is what the user expects. After all, the health and care services, meaning the total of GHA, ERS, and the care agency, cost the taxpayer over 210 million last year alone. And the GHA, Mr. Speaker, is not the only department. I'm using it as an example. Other departmental budgets are smaller, but the principles are the same. The Environment Department was 500,000 above budget. The collection and disposal of refuse was 750,000 above budget. There are other examples scattered around the budget of departments, agencies, and statutory authorities overspending by margins which are well above slight increases. This inability to keep to the budget hampers our overall ability, Gibraltar's ability, to emerge from this financial crisis, and there is a political responsibility for all this which lies at the feet of the Chief Minister, who presented last year's budget as a real attempt to start our process of recovery. In that, he has singularly failed. In fact, our position this year is worse than last year. We had to borrow £50 million more than envisaged just to keep afloat. The government spent 90 million more than it promised. Government departments for which ministers are responsible and accountable overspent by 35 million. Our direct and indirect borrowing is now at approximately 1.75 billion. Of that sum, hundreds of millions of pounds were parked in an opaque way without there being full clarity of how those monies have been spent, and indeed if they have been spent. We still do not know how much of those monies borrowed remain. This year, the Chief Minister promises to spend 723 million. In other words, 45 million less than the promise he made last year of 768 million, which he didn't keep to anyway. Last year's promise was breached because they spent 859 million. So to put it in context, this year he is promising to spend 136 million less than the government actually spent last year. Really, Mr. Speaker? After all that failure? Who believes that? It's like someone who ran a kilometer 2 minutes slower than expected, now saying that he will run it 3 minutes faster than his personal best time. He is a person, Mr. Speaker, without credibility in the field of economic promises. These promises, having been breached so often, this failure of financial discipline being so profound, he will forgive us for no longer believing he can navigate us through the storm. He's borrowed to the hilt, with even 6 of our housing estates mortgaged, with tenants locked into regular rent increases because of the terms of those facilities. People face hikes in inflation. Everything costs more. Their wages stretch to less.
The government is not providing a better service, but is asking people for more, for a worse service, and giving the people less. Prescription charges go up, and by stealth, the legal notice contains a provision that there will be inflationary prescription charge increases every year. But this is a government that issues a press release whenever it feels any sense of good news which it can capitalize on, and yet did not tell us of the expected annual prescription fee charges, an attempt to bury bad news and to hide behind the GHA. The financial stress, Mr. Speaker, is being felt by the ordinary citizen and the small business owner, who has now been left to survive out there while the government asks everyone to tighten their belt, but does not do the same itself and overspends massively in the year of the biggest financial crisis. Little surprise, then, that we have no faith in Mr. Picardo's economic management skills. He's the captain without a plan and without a clue, all spin and smoke and mirrors. Is that why, Mr. Speaker, he went to visit His Holiness the Pope in the Vatican? I mean, things must be really bad if he had to go all that way to ask for financial forgiveness and to confess his economic sins. Or as he walked those hallowed corridors and smelt the powerful incense, was it a bid for divine inspiration that would illuminate his financial path, or a request for an economic miracle, because that is what he needs now? Mr. Speaker, people are increasingly seeing that the promises are just that, empty words that are said but not kept, like the pretty pictures in the successive manifestos, like the hundreds of letters he writes to associations and individual voters at election time, hoping to persuade them to trust one more time, just one more time, one more for the road. He's addicted to debts and to economic failure. Just one more for the road doesn't cut it anymore with an electorate that can see through the smoke and mirrors of his spending and his promises. He spends the people's money like there is no tomorrow. Maybe because there's no tomorrow for him. And the signs of recklessness and the lack of realism are also there in other ways. They say they will borrow another 50 million next year. But of course, we know they did not keep to that promise last year. They are now perilously running out of leeway in the guarantee facility they negotiated, and we hear what he said this morning about that. For next year's budget, and to maintain the pretense of prudence, they've shaved off projected expenditure from high-spending departments, but without any real sense of whether these promises will be kept. Because, as I've illustrated clearly, they weren't kept last year at all. And part of the reason, Mr. Speaker, that they are projecting to spend 723 million next year is because this year they're only providing a notional 1 million contribution from the Consolidated Fund to the Improvement and Development Fund, from which, as people know, the infrastructure projects of the government are paid. The spending in the IDF seems clearly dependent on the receipt of the East Side premium of 90 million. But what happens if it isn't received? How are the extra projects going to be funded? After all, they are expecting to spend an extra 30 million this year through the IDF. For example, via that fund, it's clear that they intend to spend 2.75 million in computerization of the government, having already spent a massive 14.5 million in 2019-21. Over and above that, they intend to spend 3.75 million on so-called digital transformation, having spent 3.4 million last year. But of course, Mr. Speaker, that is a misnomer if you ever needed one, because the citizen knows that e-government is a shambles still, and there is not much to show for it. And yet the millions being spent just keep on piling up. Remarkably, the Island Games facilities are still not complete. They intend to spend another 2.3 million on those facilities this year. To complete the facilities of the Games that took place 3 years ago. If there's a monument to this government's tendency for smoke and mirrors, it is those facilities that they are still trying to finish, that were promised to sportsmen and sportswomen as a generational legacy to enhance sports facilities and training capabilities, only to be ripped up in part when the games were over, because the facade shown at the games was just that, a facade. And for these still not to be complete, even now forcing sports people to go elsewhere to do their training. This morning he called them the best sporting facilities our athletes enjoy. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they are the best sporting facilities that our athletes don't enjoy. But no worries, Mr. Speaker, because number 6 Convent Place expects to spend 50% more in its entertainment budget this year. While Rome burns, the emperor will play the fiddle and be entertained. To put it in sharper context, the government is cutting the GHA's sponsored patient budget by 4.75 million this year, or over 30%, but intends to spend 50% more by way of the Chief Minister's entertainment budget than last year. The priorities are all wrong. So you pull that picture together, Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Chief Minister says that it's to invite me to National Day. Well, that glib little remark will not obscure the reality. If you pull that picture together and you see a large public sector budget out of control, with a government preaching a tightening of the belt to others, but unable to carry it out themselves. Far from a tightening of the belt, the figures show a greater loosening by the government. If only, Mr. Speaker, they at least stuck to their budget. If only. That would be but a first step. There would then be a need to weed out inefficiencies, monitor public contracts in a better way, and cut out waste and abuse. But that seems a lost cause, with a government that has not got a clue or a real desire or commitment to rein in expenditure, prioritize properly, and become more efficient and deliver a better service to people. Above all, there is no leadership to make that happen, and that must be a conscious decision. Instead, everywhere you look, there are contradictions and incoherence. Beyond this, there remains real concerns that the people have still not been properly told how hundreds of millions of pounds borrowed in their name have been used, or if they have been used. And what we have seen over the last 12 months indicates a willingness to ignore tendering processes that the government itself had triggered. These practices affect governance and finances. So it was a few months ago that TNG, an entity that did not even exist when the expressions of interest process closed for the Bayside St. Dan's plots, were suddenly announced as having been awarded that multi-million luxury plot, despite not even having participated in the expressions of interest process. Instead of re-advertising the process, the government awarded the sites to them. That was compounded by the downright misrepresentations of the government press releases at the time, which clearly suggested that TNG had presented the highest offer, to quote from their press release, clearly implying that they had been bidders in the process when they had not. Once we made clear and put in the public domain that our own verifications suggested that the entity did not even exist when the process had closed, the government backtracked, inevitably at that stage, and to try to deflect matters, the government suggested the opposition had an agenda for some nameless developers. A complete nonsense, of course, but demonstrative of how, if there were locked up cats here, to coin the pejorative Spanish saying used by the Chief Minister on Twitter at the time, they were on that side of the house. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that the cats didn't stay locked up much longer, because days after the Bayside announcement, the same entity was also awarded the whole of the very valuable 2.5 billion Eastside development. Again, this entity had not participated in the Eastside expressions of interest process because we know it did not exist at the time. Again, the government misrepresented the position by saying TNG were the, to quote, highest bidder, when clearly they were not bidders at all at the time the process closed. Again, much more recently, the government has accepted that TNG did not submit an expression of interest by the closing date in this parliament. The 13 other bidders, Mr. Speaker, of the East Side plot and the other bidders of the Bayside St. Anne's plot may feel rightly hard done by that sequence of events. Of course, it was a complete coincidence that at the same time that those behind TNG were seeking to persuade the government that they should consider their aspirations for those plots when they had not even filed bids by the closing dates, it was a complete coincidence that those behind TNG via Trusted Novus Bank gave the government a 3.75 million donation to bail it out of the spiraling high cost of the Midtown Park. Mr. Speaker, in a rather quirky intervention at the budget last year, the Chief Minister described the donation in this way. To quote, "I am very pleased to be able to announce that the new park at Midtown is being funded entirely by a very generous donation from Trusted Novus Bank." And he went on. What an out-of-the-ordinary manner to support the community with the out-of-the-ordinary donation for an out-of-the-ordinary park area in the very center of our city. What an out-of-the-ordinary manner to support the community with an out-of-the-ordinary donation for an out-of-the-ordinary park area in the very center of our city. He used the words out of the ordinary in front of descriptive words several times for emphasis and clearly, deliberately. Mr. Speaker, given that the bank that share the same ultimate owners of TNG market themselves as the out-of-the-ordinary bank, using that as their effective strapline, out of the ordinary, and that the park eventually acquired the livery and emblem of the bank, one can be forgiven for being left thinking that these are the new depths that we have got to with this government. This is a cash-strapped government that is not only selling the family silver and looking for benefactors for its financial mistakes, but is apparently prepared to rent out the Chief Minister for short 30-second commercials, where you are assured that he will use your corporate slogan a few times. If he was in Saatchi and Saatchi, they would be proud. But to watch that performance, Mr. Speaker, was farcical and demeaning to his office, especially given the events that then unfolded a few months later when it became obvious what the donation was for. Mr. Speaker, last year the Chief Minister increased social insurance, which was a burden on small business, trying to survive. As they emerged from the COVID lockdowns, he did so by a significant margin. He also increased electricity charges, 20% for commercial electricity and 16% for home consumers. When he did so, he compared electricity charge increases in the past. This year, there's been further hikes of 8% in electricity and water charges. Of course, it's different to increase charges when wages are going up and in a buoyant economy with low inflation, where charges and increases may still leave you better off in net terms after you take account of wage rises. But when wage rises are difficult or low and inflation is high, all these charges and new indirect taxes leave the poorer worse off. So where is the real evidence that ordinary working families are being insulated from his economic mismanagement? And that is not a sentiment felt simply by the opposition. The equality rights group, who have campaigned fearlessly on social issues for decades, chastised the government recently, and rightly, for precisely running deeply contradictory financial policies, seeking a tightening of the collective belt, but being unprepared to do so itself. All this leaves people behind. We share the view that in a year of high inflation and such economic pressure, the government should be cautious about putting further pressure on workers or small business. There are people already living on a knife edge. There's a need to protect the worse off, the more vulnerable, and those on the business economic knife edge who are striving hard to put food on the table for their families and employing people who in turn need those businesses to survive. This is especially so given the rising inflation of over 7%. Everything is more expensive. People have less money in their pocket. And the problem, Mr. Speaker, with this year's measures is that it is a bag of contradictions, like everything they do. This year, and unusually, certain figures have been drip-fed into the public domain ahead of this budget debate. Additionally, they've briefed the press about how this is going to be his toughest budget. But of course, what he has omitted to say is why. And the why is because of a decade of borrowing without restraint, a decade of spending without discipline, a decade of not controlling public sector contracts, a decade of not controlling waste and abuse, a decade where systematically our money, your money, has been misspent by him and where he singularly failed to provide a strong financial legacy to future generations. We have been taken as a community to the financial cliff edge. That is why, Mr. Speaker, it is so appalling for the government to overspend in its own budget in this year, because this then creates pressure on the innocent. Workers and small business and the ordinary citizen will feel a sense of genuine outrage that the reason they face new taxes or charges or higher fees is because in the worst financial year ever, the government of Mr. Picardo has not kept to its own budget. Why should people pay for his mistakes? Because the measures, what monies are the measures that he announced this morning going to generate other than to plug the holes of his overspend, which I've explained already he did last year. Some sectors of the business sector will rightly suffer a genuine sense of dejection. There's nothing in the budget to help businesses through the current turmoil. Beyond the continuation of BEAT for part of the last financial year, the big chunk of the COVID fund was used to fund loss in revenue, although some went to expenditure of some departments, as we've seen. The social insurance price hikes last year were penal. They hit business and they eroded wages so that there were employees actually worse off even after receiving a wage rise. That's how profound the social insurance hikes last year were. He will remember that the Chamber condemned those increases because they were done without consultation and highlighted, to quote from their press release at the time, the precarious state of the government's finances in the wake of not only the COVID pandemic, but also years of rampant, recurrent, and capital expenditure. We agree. Those increases were against a backdrop of much lower inflation. And even then, there were concerns on jobs, wages, and business viability. The social insurance increases last year were from 20% to 107% at one brutal stroke. Voluntary contributions were increased by 142%. This meant around 1,100 to those taxpayers. As I said last year, COVID left certain sectors of the economy very damaged, particularly those reliant on the tourism industry, which is only now starting to come back, albeit not in the large pre-pandemic volumes. But many of those businesses remain on a precipice, and there is no real sign of government assistance or sympathy. So, for example, when the Omicron variant spread quickly and the government openly discouraged people from going out, this had a real effect on bookings and business. The public comments of the government were unsympathetic, as the Catering Association had noted itself in its public remarks at the time. Rather than give the small business sector breathing space, the government jumped from funding BEAT payments to levying higher social insurance or electricity charges, plainly inconsistent policies. And now, Mr. Speaker, now this year, further pressure has been piled on workers, ordinary families, and small business. So let me be absolutely clear on the specific budgetary measures announced today. Of course, we welcome that state pension and disability benefits should be increased by inflation, and the measures designed to assist the most vulnerable through this crisis, like, for example, the means-tested utilities credit. We agree with the measures announced in respect of adjusting income tax rates at the highest end on incomes over 500,000 a year, and the reform of rules on Category 2 individuals. We also agree with measures that would address any corporate under-declaring. Some of the other specific measures seem short-sighted and counterproductive to the economy. So, for example, of concern would be the passenger tax applied to the cruise liner market. In a notoriously competitive market that could remove any edge our market has and mean that cruisers do not dock at Gibraltar. This would be a massive mistake. It would harm the industry and jobs. That measure and our concerns will be addressed more specifically by my colleague Damon Borsino in his reply. So too, the imposition of a so-called COVID recovery charge by which companies have to pay in effect £1,250 per year. That will raise a lot of eyebrows in the business and financial services sector. Did he mean, it wasn't clear, but did he mean, and he's got the chance in reply to say, did he mean all companies or all trading companies? If the former, it will in effect strike a crushing blow to company and trust managers and potentially destabilize the big sectors of the financial services industry and with it endanger many jobs in the industry. If he meant the latter, trading companies, then this too is harsh on small business trying to make ends meet. Margins of survival, Mr. Speaker, are thin, and all he is doing is making it so much harder for business and for these. On the minimum wage, Mr. Speaker, we understand and share the concerns that we must do more for our lower paid. Of course, when this is put alongside other charges, however, and without any rebalancing relief for small business, the government may find that the effect of increasing these burdens is that small businesses on thin margins will not survive. That will mean the loss of jobs, and the irony that by seeking to increase wages, the government has caused workers to lose their jobs in some sectors. The Chief Minister has increased income tax by 2% and electricity and water charges by 8%. The fact that electricity and water prices may be higher in Spain is of little comfort to ordinary working families who may be on the edge. Food prices, Mr. Speaker, here are higher than in Spain. And there are people who are even facing difficulty going across the border, so they can't just pop over to buy food in Spain. So if we're going to do the comparison, let's do the comparison in the round. He may be dismissive about the effect of these charges, but they have to be seen in context. And as a cumulative effect, they pay its toll on the ordinary working family. Last year, electricity and water went up 16%. So in cumulative terms, it means they've raised these 24% in the space of merely 12 months. That will mean hundreds of pounds more per year for consumers, on top of the hundreds of pounds they've already been paying because of last year's increases. So combined with that and the inflation and the income tax, it will erode wages even further. It will mean that the vast majority of people will be worse off after this budget and will have less money in their pocket. And they will ask why. This is not the people's budget, Mr. Speaker. It was the last straw for him to call it that. This is not the people's budget. It is to hold the people up by the side of the road like a 15th or 16th century highwayman. This is not the Renaissance budget. I know how fond the Chief Minister is of straplines in the hope that tomorrow the headline will be the Renaissance budget. But the Renaissance was a break with the past, a great leap
into modernity. The only relevance, Mr. Speaker, to his Renaissance reference is that there were plenty of highwaymen robbing the people in Renaissance times as well. And this is all this is. This is the highwayman's budget. Stand and deliver. These are his inabilities to control expenditure, which he is now seeking to sell to people as everyone chipping in to save the country. He has the gall to sell to people after his failures, the over-expenditure last year, that this is the people's budget, a budget for them, to save the people, to save their souls, when this is only to cover his tracks and save his political future after his expenditure and overspending last year, to plug that hole. How do the words even slip out of his mouth, Mr. Speaker, when he's raised taxes and made most people worse off, after overspending last year and making our position worse than it was last year, in the year that all financial records were broken? How can he even keep a straight face after raiding everyone's pockets when all he is doing is taking more from the people? How can he treat the people with such financial disdain? Why does he not own up for the indiscipline, the overspending, the vanity projects, and say this is necessary because of that? Why doesn't he say that? Why doesn't he come and say, look, we overspend, we apologize, we made mistakes, but we've got to do this? That's not what he says. It's a different message, and he's trying to sell to people that this is the people's budget, somehow some kind of common man approach. It sticks in many people's throat, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I repeat, as I did and as I said last year, that we need a new way, and one that ditches this catalogue of failures and contradictions. We need efficiencies, control of waste, control of abuse and corruption, transparency, so there's real visibility of the economy and actual debt, real prudence, targeted business assistance to deliver restart, borrowing only to invest and to create economic activity, a program of reduction and management of borrowing, a reform of public services to deliver a better, more modern service to people, which gives the taxpayer more value for money and embraces the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, this budget does not give a true picture of public finances and is unrealistic. We cannot support it, because to do so would give the signal we support the approach of someone with no clue and no plan, that we support someone who has made our public finances even worse in the worst year of our democratic history. We aren't going to do that, and we aren't going to equivocate. As I said last year, this is not about us being seen to vote for public service salaries or not. This is about the Chief Minister, and not our hard-working public servants who grow as frustrated and tired of his lack of leadership, inconsistencies and failures as the rest of the electorate. The basic point here is this. We think that our ability to emerge from the effects of the COVID pandemic have been made worse by years of economic mismanagement. The government say that is not true. They say the deficit has nothing to do with them, and nor does our financial weakness. But putting that debate as to where we were before COVID and our relative strength or weakness, as it was, to one side, what is clear is that they had the opportunity, at the very least last year, to show discipline and leadership. That required, at the very least, that they keep to their budget. By failing to do so, they have demonstrated beyond doubt everything that they have been accused of. Mr. Speaker, this is the State of the Nation debate. And after the damning indictment, people will hear from the members on these benches about his economic record and the lack of leadership. It would be wrong and perverse to send the signal we are aiding and abetting his attempts by voting for his lack of controls and unwillingness to grapple with the hard choices necessary to steady our economy and to leave a legacy of sustainability. That would require leadership and vision. In the ambition he has to remain in power, He's sacrificing the public interest for the sake of their narrow electoral interest. That is why a change of approach is so badly needed. So we move away from his addiction to debt, his recklessness and his lack of direction, so that we can recover a better path of economic sustainability, tackle the big challenges for our community, and deliver a long-term strategy for a solvent future. Where is, for example, the big roadmap to first recognize and then deal with the issues of major public sector reform that exist? It's obvious that systems and working practices need to change to achieve a responsive, modernized, and effective public service that requires investment combined with change, not just a continuation of antiquated practices, a perpetuation of the unchecked and also untargeted, unstrategic use of money. This is as bad as throwing taxpayers' money down a deep well in some cases. The taxpayer deserves better. The people deserve better. All this, Mr. Speaker, is putting huge pressure on working families or small business because there is little financial leeway to help them out at a time of crisis, because the government led by the Chief Minister has spent all the people's money and there is no money left, borrowing from banks to pay wages and costs, which he is now having to do, is a fool's economics, and that because of historic debt and a fundamental inability to control expenditure in this time of deep crisis and make efficiencies. Everyone knows reform is necessary, and it takes courage and leadership to deal with those issues, but to deal with them consistently and show and lead by your example of having kept to the budget last year, which they failed to do. Mr. Picardo is not the man for that job because he is far too fond of just being in that job. Mr. Speaker, the people have given up hoping for financial realism, prudence, or a willingness to conduct radical economic reforms from him or his government.